beginning a stream, and then we can start.
Okay. You're gonna let me know when to start?
Yes, you can begin now.
All right. Hello, everybody. Just as I was told. I don't know. Is that correct? Have I been told the right thing? Because I did ask people, how do I say hello in Polish, and that's what I was told. So I hope I'm not making an idiot of myself and saying sunflowers or something crazy to everybody. So it's really great to be back again. I hope that you all enjoyed yesterday's talk on imagination, and if you haven't seen that, I'm sure it's available on the YouTube channel of Copernicon, so check that out if you missed that yesterday. Really nice to see so many people in here today, and really cool. So right, apologies for the technical difficulties. I was having some challenge here. Now, this is an interactive session to a large degree, so if I ask for your input, please jump on your keyboards and just throw it into chat there so that I can have a look and see. It makes it a lot more dynamic. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is creating a world that is going to do things for you rather than force you to do things for it. One of the big things that we have as game masters, as narrators, as storytellers, we have this massive pressure to create these amazing worlds, or to run worlds that already exist and to make them amazing. And that requires us, or it seems to require us, to have a huge amount of knowledge before we go into it. And I often hear about people saying, oh, I'm going to start running my game soon, but I haven't finished my world yet. I'm still making my world. And that does take a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And then people get frustrated because they've spent all of this time making this amazing world and filling in all of the details and doing all of the things that they think they're supposed to be doing, and then their players never come across it. And they often find that everything that they have prepared is stuff that might get mentioned once, but it's not what the players want to know. And that's because players want to know things relative to the adventure that they're in. That's the stuff they want to explore during the game. And a lot of times you don't know what that is because you're planning adventures one step at a time, and the players are looking for angles on how to triumph within that adventure. So they're going to be asking questions specific to the adventure, not to the world. So what we've got to do is we've got to step back and say, okay, let's think about how we design our worlds in a different way. And hopefully you're going to see that in the presentation today. Now, I've realized that I need to do this with my chat. Bear with me here, folks. If any of you have ever seen my live shows before, you'll know that I'm a little bit technologically challenged sometimes. So bear that in mind. But here we go. So just a little bit about me before we jump into creating these new amazing worlds. My name is Guy, and I run a YouTube channel called How to Be a Great GM, where I give talks every week on different topics within the role-playing space. So check me out if you haven't already. All right, so step one, and I use this phrase very specifically. You have to build your prison. You have to design your prison. And this is a metaphorical prison. It is not an actual prison. It's not an actual dungeon. It is a containment. It is a space in which you are going to be limited. And there's a really important reason about why you need to be limited. And I want you to keep this in mind throughout this entire lecture. When you have no limits, which when you begin GMing, when you begin creating your adventure, when you start role-playing, you have no limits. You can do anything you like. If you want to run a game where you are playing My Little Pony and you are all rainbow unicorns running around, or you want to do Harry Potter, or you want to do Dracula, or you want to do Star Wars or Dungeons and Dragons, you have an infinite choice. And the problem with infinity, the problem with a huge amount of choices, is that oftentimes you don't know where to even start. You don't know which choice to make, which is the right choice, which is the wrong choice. You don't know where to go with that. And that's an important consideration, is that when you have so many choices, you end up becoming paralyzed. Or if you're like me, you start to choose one choice and you start working on that, and then you get a little bit sidetracked with that choice because that choice could be interesting too. And then you kind of look at the two and you go, well, neither of those are as interesting as that one, and I might just take that one too. And so then, if you're like me, I went through a period where every 3 weeks we were starting a new game. Or every 4 weeks, I'd go, I'm bored with this story. I want to do a Star Wars. I want to do a this. I want to do a that. I want to do something different. And so you just never end up settling on one thing because you are choosing from the infinite world. You are choosing from so many different options, and you're not being restricted to one. So when we start to contain our thinking, when we start to say, this is our prison, we are only allowed to do in what is inside here, suddenly, instead of having an infinite amount of choices, we only have a few choices. And then we can say, well, I've got 7 choices. I'm going to choose choice number 3. And it allows us to be a lot more confident in our choice. It allows us to look at our choices a lot more carefully and decide, aha, 1, I don't like. 2, I kind of like. 3 is really good. 4, no. 5, 6, 7, right. 3 it is. And with confidence, you can take that, and then you know that is your flag. The rest you can then throw away, and you don't ever have to worry about thinking about them again. So that is a very, very strong fundamental idea that we need to keep in our minds, is that we are narrowing our choices so that we can actually make choices. So building your prison. To build your prison, the first thing you need to do is you need to set your goal. And your goal should be, why are you making this world in the first place? What does it need to do? Does it need to terrify your players? Does it need to exist because you want to make your own world? That's not enough. You need to make a world that works for you. And oftentimes you will hear people, when they are really passionate about their worlds, if you look at J.R.R. Tolkien, you look at, what's his name? How many J and R's does Martin's have? Is he also J.R.R. Martin? Maybe I should change my name to J.R.R. It seems to be a very easy way to write very well-selling books, perhaps. Anyway, that's a whole different question. So when we are looking at setting a goal, we have to decide why we're making the world. When I look at the world that I created, which you can't see behind me because the screen's so small, so I'm going to show it to you there. So when you look at that world behind me there, that is a map of a world that I made. That is Braxia. That is a world that I created. Now, I created it in 2004 or 5. So that's a very long time ago. And I have stayed in that world. I've occasionally dabbled in other worlds, but most of the time, I go back to Braxia. Why do I go back to Braxia? Because I had a goal when I was making Braxia, and my goal was to create a world that had all of the cultures that I liked in it. I like ancient Egyptians. I like Romans. I like certain aspects of Transylvania and the Bohemian kingdom and space along those lines. I like Vikings. I like, well, let me rephrase this. It's not that I like a Nazi environment. As a GM, I like to have a Nazi-like environment because they are the very best bad guys in terms of being evil and having a very ruthless approach to things. I like Japanese Edo period culture. So I created a world that has all of those in them. And I know they come from different time periods in our own planet, but I wanted them all in one world in a fantasy setting because those are the things that excite me. Those are the things that I look at and I go, aha, My options are limited to these particular cultures, and this is how they're going to be expressed in my world. So by setting yourself a goal that is going to make you happy. So my goal is to make a world that's terrifying. My goal is to make a world that is fun. My goal is to make a world that incorporates mushrooms or unicorns, rainbow unicorns. Let's use that for tonight's talk. Rainbow unicorns. If you have a goal, you are in a really good space. It's going to really, really help you. You then need to set your tone. Now, by tone, what I mean is the mood, the atmosphere. What is it? Is it dark? Is it gritty? Is it grim? Is it horrific? My worlds are always dark, gritty, grim comedies, because that's what I like. I like there to be extremes of suffering and pain and sadness, and then joy and jokes and humor so that you laugh along the way. I personally think that that's the best kind of story mix that you can have. There are many different tones you can have. You could have romantic, you could have action where there is no really dark and gritty. The hero never really gets tortured. It's always just a little bit of torture, but that doesn't really count as real torture. There's no trauma. It's entirely up to you to decide what is the tone of your world. And once you've chosen your tone, again, do you see it's giving you a constraint? It's giving you your prison. It is saying that the tone of this world is, let's go with light adventure action comedy. And we're going to have rainbow unicorns everywhere. That means that when you are deciding what adventures you're going to be doing, you are looking at your adventure from the point of it being a light action comedy, as opposed to a deep psychological dive into the multifaceted mind of a warped necromancer who raises the undead so that he can use them to destroy the living because in his childhood he suffered terribly at the hands of his uncle. That's really, really dark and doesn't belong in your world. So I hope, and please type into chat, yes, you get it, that you get what I'm talking about when I'm talking about giving yourself constraints and being able to use those constraints to help you plan your campaign. Please put the word yes into chat if you get what I'm saying. So then I know I can move on and I can move forward a little bit. Yes, there we go. Mikhail, thank you. Przema, thank you. Yes, says Jimmy. Okay, awesome. Fantastic. I can move forward. So you choose your tone, then you choose your reality. What are your laws? Do you have magic? Do you have strange physics? Do you have psychics? Do you have dinosaurs? Designing your world means that you are bringing in things that you really like. I love dinosaurs. I absolutely do from the age of, I can't remember until now, I love dinosaurs. I still have a dinosaur skeleton behind me. And I'm not a kid anymore. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs RPG, says Jimmy. Absolutely. So you decide what's in your world and then you stick to it. Now, if you are playing Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of these things have already been decided for you. You have magic, you have some strange physics like floating islands and airships and dragons and things. You have psychics in a weird kind of form. You have these various elements. Again, this is just helping you to provide yourself with those constraints that we're going to be talking about, or we are talking about. You then need to step back and say, okay, well, what do you expect from this world? So in our rainbow unicorn world with a light, happy, adventurous setting, what do we expect? Well, in my mind, I expect there to be the areas where the unicorns are happy and safe, and there's sparkling water fountains everywhere and candy floss. I don't know why. And life is great. And then I expect there to be areas that are slightly dark, very blue or very green, that may have forests with little spiders in them that we think are scary because they're big hairy spiders, but actually they're quite friendly and they like to be stroked. And when you stroke them, they make a purring sound. That's what I expect from that kind of world. What do you expect? Well, expectations are all part of our bigger psyche in terms of the talk I did last night on imagination, but also in terms of what we personally expect. And I can certainly say with fairly a large amount of confidence that our expectations, if you are in Poland versus my expectations of here in the UK, are quite different on certain subjects. They might not be vastly different, but they might have a different perspective. They might have a slightly different angle or a different take on that. So I expect candy floss and hairy spiders that make happy sounds when you stroke them. What do you expect when I say rainbow unicorn candy floss land? What is in your mind as one of those things that would be in there? The reason why we need to jot down what we expect is because that allows us to then say, okay, well, what do our players expect? And are we putting that in there? So if we expect there to be a candy floss bush that people can eat from, and it's not there, surely our players will also be going, it's not there. Just like with Dungeons and Dragons, if you expect to have Dungeons and Dragons, you expect Dungeons and Dragons to be in the game, right? And yet I think I have not run a proper dungeon in Dungeons and Dragons in forever. I hate dungeon crawls. I find them very, very dull. Personally, as a player and as a GM, I don't do them. My dungeons are usually 4 or 5 rooms, maybe maximum. I don't do these big epic sprawling dungeon things. And the last game I played, which was a dungeon crawl, I got so bored after session 15, I literally had my character try to kill themselves because they couldn't escape from this dungeon. It was insanity. I hated it. I absolutely hated it. So again, okay, I see. Good. Headbanger is arguing, saying dungeons are fun if you play it's tactical survival. Yeah, but you see, now when you're talking about that, Headbanger, as a tactical survival game, that might have been your GM's goal, or that might be your goal, is to create a tactical survival game where you're going to be keeping track of rations, of your water amount, of your arrows or your ammunition that your archer is going to be firing out at random. You're going to track all of that kind of thing. And so the whole game is this gritty survival type of situation. If that's the mindset going in, if our expectations are that we're going to be playing this kind of game, absolutely. But do you see how then your thinking is going to be guided along providing those expectations, providing those moments of finding replenishment, providing those moments of moving it away? By being conscious of the fact before we even start creating our world of our goals and our expectations and things, it allows us to then build them into the environment, build them into the entire thing so that we can then get there. You then need to set your limits. How much do you need to make now? And as far as I'm concerned, how much do you need to make now? I generally work on drawing a map. If it's a global map, if I'm making a whole world, then I will draw the entire world. But if it's just a little region, I will then draw as much as the characters can travel in a single 24-hour period. So if my players' characters start in the center of the map, I draw a map that goes to 24 hours in all directions. If it's regular travel, if they're traveling on horseback, how far can you go in 24 hours? That's the edge of the map in all directions. If there are teleportation circles, well, that's how far I need to draw out, because my players might end up at the very beginning of the game getting on a horse or getting into a teleportation circle and teleporting as far as they can. That's possible, but I don't go further than that because I need a limit. Otherwise, I'm going to create an entire world that my players are only ever going to explore one village of. That's insanity. So we don't want to do that. So you got to set your limits. Okay. Then you step back and you say, well, why would you want to visit this place? Why would you want to go there? Because if you don't want to go there, why would anybody else want to go there? And that's something that I think we often forget to do, is we forget to say, well, I've created this cool world, but I actually wouldn't want to go there. So when I look at the worlds that I've created or that I have played in, would you actually want to go and play in a Wild West scenario? Would you currently right now happily step into the Wild West? I certainly would not. Thank you very much. I certainly wouldn't want to go back into the Roman time period as I am now. But as a person playing a game, I love to go into those time periods because of the opportunity of riding a horse or being part of a legion of troops trying to take a fortification or whatever that might be. Do you see? I'm expecting to be able to do that in that environment. So again, why would you visit there? It's going to help you to understand what people are going to expect, but it's also going to help you to refocus and say, well, I expect there to be a dungeon, or expect there to be a dragon. Okay, let me go back and add to my rules that there is a dragon present. So hopefully you are now starting to get a picture of what we need to do. Okay, so we've now kind of got this rough idea of this space that we're making. It's not complete by any means. What we now need to do is we now need to visit our prison. So visualization is absolutely, absolutely key. And that means drawing a map. You need to draw a map, and I've spoken about drawing a map with 24 hours travel in diameter. That's what I usually work to. It's the one that I think is simplest and most straightforward. Then what you need to do is you need to express the reality laws. This is something that I find personally a major failing in world building, is where you have one area of the world that has this weird magic and nowhere else. And you go, that pains me. That really deeply pains me as a consistency kind of thing. If you look at our own planet, we have lots of really weird things going on our planet. We have rivers that flow backwards. We really do. It's a function of tide movement. It's not actually the river flowing backwards, it's the tide pushing in. But the water is flowing backwards sometimes during the day, and sometimes it's flowing forwards. We have glaciers that wander around mountains and things. We have areas that are so toxic nothing can live there except for the stuff that lives there. You know, we have these amazing things, but generally speaking, they're there for a reason. So if you have set in your reality that magic is there, you need to understand how magic is then going to affect the environment. How is that affecting geography? How is that affecting, and then how do you show that? Now, what we also need to express is the tone that we chose. The tone was dark and gritty. Okay, the world needs to be dark and gritty. We need lots of areas of wastelands, of deserts, of dry areas, of swamps, places that are going to make you depressive. Our rainbow unicorns with their candy floss bushes. We're going to need to have lots of light, happy areas, and possibly rainbow bridges that allow you to teleport from one area to another quite easily. And then we're going to have the sad lands, which are not particularly terrifying, but which are slightly bluish in color and maybe purple in color. Disney likes to use lime green and purple for their villains. All of their villains throughout time have always had that color scheme: black, purple, and lime green. It's what they have associated with evil and with darkness. He-Man and the Masters of the Universe does the same thing. Skeletor is also purples, blacks, lime greens, and of course his yellow skull, which oftentimes is actually lime green. So they are showing us the tone visually. So on your map, you need to do exactly the same thing. We then need to, as I said, express your tone. We then need to define areas that your PCs are going to start in and where they could potentially move to. Now, this is not trying to railroad the PCs into they will go here or they will go there or they will go there. This is more a case of saying, okay, my PCs are starting in this town, in this area, and they are more than likely going to explore in the immediate vicinity. Certainly, I have some adventures in mind which will keep them in that area, but I want to kind of center my campaign in this zone. I don't need to go further out. If they go further out, that's their choice, and I will accommodate. But we don't want to necessarily do that. We want to kind of hold them where we want them to be. Okay, then we need to add in our civilization hubs. Someone has to live in our world and they need to live in certain places. We need to put those places probably at about 24 to 48 hours travel from each of the different destinations. That's usually kind of how it worked. You don't want to spend too much time on the road, maybe 72 hours maximum between a major settlement and a little hamlet. It's just too dangerous to travel for longer periods of time, usually speaking. Of course, it depends on your world and the tone within your world. Once we've done that, we then need to break out of our prison. So we've got all of our rules, we've got our constraints, we've got our tone, we've got our ideas, we're expressing all of those ideas, we're showing all of those ideas. And then we need to break out of our prison. So now we know our playing ground, our playing field. Now we need to start exploring. And that means that we need to start looking at our species. And where did this species start? And how did they get to where they got to? I'm not writing giant paragraphs of information here. What I am doing is I'm saying the orcs started here. Why did they stay here? If you look at human history, we didn't stay where we started. It doesn't matter which history you prefer to use as your own. We are a migratory species one way or another. It is sometimes curiosity, but most of the time it is requirement. We move from one area to another. It becomes arid. We move somewhere else. So if you want to build in history into your world, build in the movements of certain key species. Why did they leave or why didn't they leave? And think about the ramifications of that. We also need to create some kingdoms and some nations, but how many nations and how many kingdoms do you need? Well, to begin with, you need the kingdom or the nation that your players are starting in, and if there is a border nearby, then you need to drop in some other kingdoms. Now, of course, if your players are playing different species and they want to come from different areas, they can, although generally speaking, what I do is I say, all right, you are from different species, and I will give you some kingdom history for each of your locations to put into your backstory, but you're all starting in this town on this part of my map. Most of the time, the players will be satisfied with that, and they won't ask you too many questions. A little trick that I like to do, especially if it's in a new world, is that I like to get the players to give me their interpretation of their culture and their history. Okay, so you're playing a half-orc. What do you think half-orcs are treated like in the kingdom that you rose up in, knowing that the kingdom is a monarchy that is quite xenophobic and quite afraid of outsiders? That's three things that you had to come up with for that kingdom. You didn't have to come up with a long history or anything along those lines, just three little things. You gave some constraints. You gave some parameters for the player to then go, well, I think half-orcs would have been treated as second-class citizens, or I think people wouldn't have cared. They would have seen them as a mixture of the best of both worlds. As a GM, you could go, maybe, but they're xenophobic, so they would probably have seen you as containing the evil of others. So perhaps you would have lived in a little colony on the edge of the kingdom, because otherwise you would have been in trouble. Do you see how all of the constraints that we're putting into place limit your thinking and force you to look at outcomes based on your options rather than to try and come up with an option out of thin air? So we create our kingdoms. Now we want to add in some magic. And when I say add in some magic, I'm not talking necessarily nadrach uthvas bethud type magic. I am talking the magic of your world, the idea of maybe there's science, maybe there's steampunk. What is this magic in your world space? How is it used? Is it legal? So if you look at the Roman Empire, they had soothsayers and they had oracles who determined the future. Well, the ancient Greeks had more of the oracle stuff. Was that real magic, or was that just someone anticipating and looking at political upheaval? Who knows? We need to come up with some kind of magic in our world. Star Trek has magic. The dilithium crystals allowing the ship to travel faster than light, warp speed, the Vulcan stuff. Star Wars is full of magic, the Force magic. So how does it get treated? How does it get used? How do we look at all of that kind of stuff? So you got to put that in, and then you've got to put in communications. How do nations communicate? This is an important thing. Communication is absolutely key. Most kingdoms can only get as large as their communication can travel within a certain amount of time. So, for example, if you look at the Roman Empire, they became very large because they had very good communication technology. They had really, really worked it out very, very well, as opposed to, say, the Zulu nation on the southern tip of South Africa, where the empire stretched to about 3 days in all directions of travel because they didn't have horses. So it was people running on foot. Beyond that, it starts to become unmanageable and unruly to try and patrol and make sure that everyone remains in alignment. So communication is important. Is it magic communication? Is it good old-fashioned horses? Is it those little communities that you've put down every 72 hours worth of travel or 48 hours worth of travel. Those would have little post offices, little posts for the horses to be tied up to, so that then the post can then move from one to the next, those kinds of things. So we look at our communications. We then look at transportation. As you can see, horses, asses. So an ass is a mixture of a mule and a donkey, I believe, or is it a horse and a donkey, or a horse and I don't know. Anyway, there are all kinds of different forms of transportation that your world can take. Again, this is going to determine how big your nations can be. It's going to determine how rapidly things can respond to things. And also importantly, it's going to determine how far things can travel. Now, if you look at our own world, when we only had horses as our fastest means of travel, or boats, if you look at it from that perspective, the ancient Egyptians were pretty well connected from the north of Europe all the way across to China, and then down into and all the way to the bottom of southern Africa. So they're very well connected, if somewhat slowly connected. So that's very, very important. And then finally, you need to visit your world. You need to actually get in there and visit your world. And how do you do that? Drop in. Just go in there. I often say what I do is I choose a point on my map where I think I'm going to start my adventure, and then I simply close my eyes and I imagine myself standing on the map, and I look around and I listen. What does it sound like? What does it smell like? What is the paving under my feet? Is it neat paving that is done by hand? Has it been done by magic using a shaped stone? I try and envisage the space that I am in as much as I can, so that I feel like I've been there. Because again, then I'm not making stuff up. I'm drawing from my memory and from my imagination, because I've been there. So I've seen that the houses look like this. So they probably have an entrance at the back for the servants, because the front looks so nice. They don't want servants going in through the front. Or they have it this, or they have it that. So physically visit your world in your mind's eye. Eat some food. What's the best food? What's the worst food? Invariably, your players are going to end up with their characters in a tavern or a bar at some point, and then they're going to order something. Give them something different. Give them something weird. Trust me, it will leave an indelible mark on their minds as they go, oh, well, that's really weird. Then figure out what happens with crime. How will they catch you? Think about this. If your player characters commit a crime, is there a guard who's going to come running in the next 2 minutes? Is there an omnipresent kind of entity watching the entire city? Think about those aspects and then figure out how they make adventures better. So when we look at a lot of science fiction shows where there are cameras everywhere and everything is being monitored, committing a crime is almost impossible if you do it in a relatively straightforward environment. And you look at today where we have cameras everywhere, it becomes problematic from a story perspective. So you need to figure out, how can you get away with crime? Is there corruption? Can you bribe someone? Those kind of things. You need to figure out how your nation is going to go to war. Would they conscript? Would they ask people to join? What is that kind of thing? What are the gods? What are their functions? Are they real, or are they just up in the air? So that's what you kind of have to look at on the surface. But again, you're not writing paragraphs and pages of information. You're jotting down just a few notes. And the reason for that is because you need to step back at this point and say, right, it is time for my prison to change into a theme park, because it is time for my players to arrive. But before they get there, you have to ask the question, what is the promise? What does this world promise to my players? Does it promise them the adventure of defeating giant dragons? Does it promise them the joy of traveling on a rainbow sparkle bridge? I don't know why I went high there, but I kind of feel that's the right voice for that area. Does it give them that kind of promise? And if it doesn't give them that promise, you have to go back into those previous 4 steps and add it in there somewhere. Don't be afraid to go back and change. That's the important thing. You then need to say, okay, what adventures are leaping out at me whenever I get given a new setting book to look at? And I get given settings books all the time. I look through the setting book, and this is the first question I ask. What adventure is being promised to me as the GM, as the player? Is it an adventure of potentially slaying all the dragons and becoming a dragon king? Is it owning dragons and being a dragon rider? We need to know what are the adventures, and if adventures don't pop out at you, then quite frankly, it's probably not a good setting for you. If you handed me a rule book that said, right, this is the Grand Prix role-playing game where you role play as drivers in the Grand Prix. There's no magic, it's all real, and basically it's about role-playing the drivers. No adventures immediately pop out at me for that setting. I could think of a murder mystery that the Grand Prix people are involved in. I could think of a car transfer, but I can't actually think of a Grand Prix adventure. But that's me, because I don't know anything about the Grand Prix. And I am assuming that's the one that has the cars in it. So the adventures have to pop out. If they don't, you've got to go back and fix it. Are your expectations met? Remember those expectations we set right in the beginning, that you want to see dragons or dungeons or rainbow bridges or all of that kind of stuff? We need to make sure that those are in there. We need to go back and put them in. And then, of course, we just need to go back and refine and add and remove. However, you do that once or twice, and once you can answer, yes, there are adventures, yes, my expectations have been met, that's when you introduce it to your players, and that's when your players start asking you questions. And because you have built your world in such a way that you've figured out the basics, when they ask you the question, this nation, what happens? Is there a hero from the past in this nation that once killed a dragon? You know that your adventure is grim dark. Yes, the hero did kill a dragon once in the past. Unfortunately, the way he did it was by allowing the dragon to consume him, and he had himself eaten a rare poison that, when it came into contact with the juices of the dragon's stomach, exploded, and that destroyed the dragon as well as the hero. That's a grim, dark kind of setting. Whereas if it's a light setting, you go, yes, absolutely. But the hero didn't slay the dragon. No, the hero realized that the dragon was misunderstood, and they had a conversation and they became friends. And the friendship was legendary for the adventures that they went on. I've got two very different scenarios, both come up on the fly, based from looking at my constraints, from looking at the rules that I've put in position. I didn't have to write those legends before the game started. I'm now only creating those legends as the players are asking for them, but the legends remain consistent for the world that I have created, because I have created the space in which the world can operate. I went through this really quickly, folks, because we are on a hard deadline here, so I don't know if we have time for questions, but I hope this was helpful in some way, enlightening in some way, gets you to think in a little bit of a different way, rather than trying to focus on your law, focus on the whole idea, giving yourself some constraints. So I think we've got a minute for questions. So if you can type really quickly, I can answer some questions. Unless there's a question saying, well, how long until the end? Because then that answer is, well, they're pretty much now. So there we are. I hope this was useful in some way and not too quick or crazy. Thanks, Jimmy. It was good to get that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the interesting information. I'm sure we will all benefit from it, and the worlds we create will be beautiful and interesting. I hope so. I hope so. Really, the goal is about taking the burden away from us as creators to have to create everything up front, to realizing that it should be a journey where we're exploring the space that we want to be in. So hopefully this will help you do that. Now, I have been allowed to talk about this. This is my book called The Practical Guide to Becoming a Great GM. It goes on to Kickstarter on Tuesday. So if you go to Kickstarter right now and type in The Practical Guide to Becoming a Great GM, you will see that this book pop up. In this book, it is everything that I've spoken about now in terms of world building, but it is so much more. It is literally everything you need in order to look at your game mastering and look at how do you run your games from a very different perspective. And that's the perspective of constraints rather than planning everything out and trying to figure out what your players are going to do. No. Your players are going to tell us what they're going to do. And we need to make sure that we are in a space where our world, where our campaign, where our adventures are definitely telling us how that should work out. There are so many games. Isn't it easier to use the ready-made worlds instead of creating your own? Asks Michael Kuras. I'm glad you asked that question. I'm going to take a very few moments to answer that question. So if you take an existing world, let's say you take Star Trek or you take Star Wars, you are still under a large amount of pressure to remember all of that information for that world. I very seldom will take an existing world. I will probably use Star Wars or Star Trek if I'm running a game system. That's probably the only world that I will take. But if it's a fantasy world, I usually make my own. The challenge is, A, you have to remember all of that lore, and B, if someone knows that world better than you and you try and make something up, they're going to say, actually, that isn't the capital of this country. This is the capital of that country. So when I take worlds, when I take existing worlds, what I do is I step back and I say, okay, what was the existing world's promise? What's its theme? What's its idea? What is its core? And I go through all of the steps that I've just gone through now, unpacking that existing world, so that when I then start to play in it, I will always warn my players beforehand. I will say, you are now stepping into my version of Star Wars, or you are stepping into my version of Star Trek. Many things are still the same. There are some fundamentals that I cannot change because that's what you're expecting. You're expecting stormtroopers and the Emperor and Jedi and bounty hunters and that sort of thing. So I still have to give you that, because remember, expectation is part of that. But what you're not expecting is that I'm actually setting the game slightly away from the central space, or I'm setting in a slightly different time period. So not all of those things are going to come into play. Now, Headbanger raises another very good point. Why not use one of the player's knowledge? Because a lot of times the player will have knowledge, but if you are running a game and one of the other players says, oh, what was the name of the king from Three Kingdoms Over? I forget his name. If you turn to the player and the player goes, oh, that was King Theodore, it means you're always going to have to go to that player to remember it was King Theodore. You are not internalizing, you're not controlling and taking ownership of that. So what I would do is I would go, oh, it was King Theodore. That is correct. But when they arrive in the kingdom and I say it's actually King Randolph, and the player goes, sorry, it was King Theodore. It was. But last week, something happened. So if you use an existing world, there are a lot of different pressures on you in terms of being able to control your game. And what I'm saying is we need to step back from having that pressure placed upon us in terms of remembering all of this stuff, and be free to just run and create a space and enjoy the space as spectators. All right, so now I'm going to be running a game of Dungeons and Dragons in a couple minutes. As a matter of fact, I'm going to ask that we can take just a 5-minute break, Sala, for this, please, before we actually start running that game. And that game, I'm going to demonstrate to you how these constraints are used, because I'm going to show you my notes right now for that D&D game. There are my notes. I haven't got any. I'm going to ask you to give me the adventure, and we're going to work that through, and then we're going to run it. Okay, so in 5 minutes time, so 5 minutes to the hour if possible, is when we'll come back, I guess, or on the hour would be even better if possible. Sala, can I do that? I'm being very, very, very cheeky and asking for more time. So let's just see.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Can we start exactly at 7 o'clock? Oh, sorry, on the hour, 7 p.m. for me?
Yes, of course.
Lovely, thank you. All right, so then I will be back in 10 minutes. Thank you everybody for your answers and for your questions, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much. I will close